The drainage wall gave way at 7:15 on an April morning, and Donovan Frey went down with it into 3 meters of darkness and cold stone. He landed hard on his left side inside what had once been a homesteader's drainage chamber, black water already wicking through the knee of his work pants. A rotted crossbeam rolled from the wall when the earth shifted and came to rest across his left forearm, pinning it flat against the slope. The pain registered before the fear did. That was how his body had always worked. 22 years of it trained into him, and he was not sure whether to be grateful. Slate was beside him before the falling stopped. The 9-month-old border collie cross had fallen with the slope and landed on the lower bank, shaken but unhurt. She pressed herself against Donovan's right side without waiting for permission, her body warm against the cold stone, her gray and white muzzle turned toward his face, the way it turned toward anything she was trying to understand. The gray merle patch above her left eye made her look perpetually skeptical, as though she had formed an opinion about the situation and found it wanting. Above them, through the torn-open earth, Donovan could see the April sky. Beau stood at the edge of the collapse with his rust-colored ears flat, the left one folded at the tip the way it always was. Rain moved through the morning above him in slow sheets. He was not making a sound. Donovan reached for his radio. Static, stone and mud and 2 meters of Alberta soil swallowed the signal completely. He tried the beam once. It moved less than a centimeter before a shelf of earth poured from the wall behind it. He stopped. He looked up at Beau. "Find Isaac," Donovan said. His voice came out level. He had practiced that voice on worse mornings than this. Beau didn't move. His gaze went from Donovan to Slate and held there, and something in his posture named the difficulty of the thing he was being asked to do. Go. 1 step back. Then Beau turned, and his dark shape crossed the April field and disappeared into the spruce. But could one young dog navigate a kilometer of flooded trail to reach a man he'd only known for 3 weeks? Before the meltwater climbing Donovan's wrists made the question irrelevant. Before we get there, tell us what province you're watching from in the comments below, and subscribe to Paws of Grit for more stories of grit, loyalty, and the grace that arrives when you've stopped believing you deserve it. 3 weeks earlier, Donovan Frey had been renting a single room above Elgin Hardware on Center Street in High River. He had lived there for 14 months. The room held a cot, a propane camp stove, a filing cabinet he used as a dresser, and 3 shelves of library books he had not returned. There was a window facing the alley. He preferred it to the street-facing option because fewer cars passed at night, and no one stood under it to talk. He was 58 years old, 2 meters flat in his socks, with the kind of build that came from years of work rather than any particular effort, broad through the chest and thick in the forearms. His hair had gone the color of river ice, mostly gray with faint brown underneath, and he wore it close-cropped out of old habit. His eyes were a dark, still blue that people sometimes mistook for calm. He had left the Canadian Forces at 53 after 22 years that had taken him from basic training to Joint Task Force 2 to a desk in Ottawa he had left without cleaning out. In the years after, he had done security work, fixed industrial equipment, and driven long-haul freight on the night routes because the roads were empty and no one expected conversation. His wife Colleen had died of cancer 2 winters ago, 6 weeks after the diagnosis, before either of them had time to prepare for it. He still kept her photograph on the filing cabinet, the one from the lake in 2016, where she had turned her face away from the camera the moment he pressed the shutter, the way she always did. He told himself High River was temporary. After 14 months, he had stopped telling himself anything at all. The call came on a Thursday from a solicitor named Colette Gendron out of Lethbridge, handling his late uncle's estate. She had the careful, unhurried voice of someone shaped by years of delivering news that was neither good nor bad, but simply complicated. "The title has transferred," she said. "The Pincher Creek property is yours. 41 acres, a farmhouse, an equipment shed, and water rights to the North Creek. The house has been unoccupied since your uncle moved into care, roughly 5 years." Donovan had visited the property twice in his life, both times as a child. He remembered a farmhouse with a green metal roof and a cracked linoleum floor, and the smell of pipe tobacco drifting through every room. He remembered standing in a field at dusk, while the Rockies turned from pink to gray, and thinking the silence was the loudest thing he had ever heard. 4 days later, he loaded 2 duffel bags and a toolbox into his half-ton and drove south on Highway 2 toward the foothills. He did not call anyone. There was no one in particular to call. He stopped for fuel and coffee at a country crossroads outside Claresholm. The station sat beside a feed and seed store with a corrugated steel roof and a gravel lot scattered with old tractor tires and bale netting. At the far end of the building, under an overhang, a woman had set 2 wire crates on a folding table with a hand-lettered sign between them, "Working Dogs. Good homes only, no time wasters." Donovan had not planned to stop. He stopped anyway. The female in the left crate watched him approach without moving closer. She was mostly black and white, with a gray merle patch above her left eye and amber undertones across her back. Her ears were fully upright and her gaze did not waver. She was reading him the same way he had been trained to read terrain, systematically, without rushing to a conclusion. The male in the right crate was a different proposition entirely. He was rust and white, slightly bulkier than his sister, with one ear standing straight and the left one folded at the tip. He had been sitting when Donovan arrived, but was now standing, now sitting again, now pressing his nose through the wire. He seemed to believe the crate was a temporary misunderstanding he intended to clear up shortly. "Looking at the dogs?" said a woman's voice. Marlene was perhaps 70, compact and capable-looking, with silver hair cut practically short, and the kind of sun-darkened face that came from decades outdoors rather than any carelessness. She held a thermos and wore barn boots that had not been cleaned for years. She did not seem to be selling anything. She seemed to be conducting a quiet interview with each person who stopped. "One of them," Donovan said. Marlene looked at him the way she had looked at the crates. "They're 9 months. Littermates from a working line out of Lethbridge. Border Collie cross. The father was a shepherd. They've been around cattle and machinery their whole lives." "Why are you selling?" "My daughter's moving me to Red Deer in June. She means well." Marlene did not make the statement into a complaint. It was simply the shape of the thing. They need more room than a condo balcony. Donovan crouched in front of the female's crate and held his knuckles near the wire. The dog leaned forward, considered his hand with her nose, then sat back and resumed her assessment. "She takes her time," Marlene said. Nothing wrong with that. He had been thinking about a single dog in a practical way, one animal to manage, one set of costs, one relationship to navigate. He had become very skilled at limiting the surface area of things that could hurt him. "I'll take her," he said and stood. Marlene opened the crate and clipped on a lead. The female Donovan already thought of her as Slate, though he had not said it aloud, stepped down carefully, keeping her body low while she read the new ground. Behind them, something scraped against wire. The male had pushed one front paw beneath his crate door until his claws were on the gravel. He was not crying. He was simply making a fact visible. Slate stopped walking. Donovan gave the lead a gentle pull. She turned in a slow, complete circle and stepped back toward her brother. "They been apart much?" Donovan asked. Marlene looked at the foothills. "Not overnight. They sleep with their spines touching through the wire. I tried separating them once, in October, just for the day. The noise they made is not something I want to repeat." "You could have mentioned that earlier." "I could have." Marlene waited. Donovan looked at the male's paw on the gravel. He thought about a morning 11 years ago in a different country. A vehicle pulling away from a position in the dark, one man unaccounted for, orders clear, and the ground moving beneath every decision. The man had come home eventually, but Donovan remembered the space beside him during the extraction, and the way he had stared at the empty ground, while telling himself that following orders and abandonment were not the same thing. He had spent years believing that. "How much for both?" he asked. Marlene named a fair number. They transferred the crates to the pickup bed together, covered them against the April chill, and left room for air. Donovan tested every strap twice. Marlene noticed and said nothing. Before she closed Slate's crate, she rested one hand briefly against the dog's head, a gesture that did not ask to be witnessed. Right decision, Marlene said quietly. Usually feels wrong for the first little while. Donovan pulled onto the highway as the light went gold over the foothills. In the rearview mirror, Beau paced twice, circled, and pressed his nose against the mesh window to the cab. Slate sat still, her eyes fixed southwest, toward whatever waited beyond the last visible ridge. The gravel road to the property turned off the highway south of Pincher Creek, climbed through a stand of poplar, and crested a low hill before descending into a sheltered valley where the farmhouse stood. It was smaller than Donovan remembered, but more solid. The green metal roof had lost some of its color to the years. The porch sagged at the left corner, and 2 windows had been covered with plywood from inside. He made a temporary enclosure from fence panels he found behind the equipment shed, let the dogs out one at a time, set their food bowls near the porch. Slate ate after he stepped back. Beau ate while Donovan was still holding the bowl. That night, Beau found a rubber boot near the barn door and carried it across the yard with the dignity of a man transporting something irreplaceable. When Donovan said leave it, Beau sat on top of the boot and gazed at the sky. A laugh came out of Donovan's chest before he could think to stop it. The sound felt unfamiliar, like a joint that hadn't been used in a while. Slate watched him from across the porch with her permanent expression of careful evaluation. He had the sense she was filing the information somewhere. The neighbor arrived the following afternoon in a muddy blue half-ton with a cracked passenger mirror. Isaac Prudhomme was 67, stocky and deliberate in his movements, with a nearly bald head, a close-trimmed gray beard, and pale blue eyes that carried humor in them constantly, though his face released it only when he chose. He had farmed the adjacent property for 35 years, and had the particular patience of a man who had outlasted several things that once seemed permanent. He arrived with a post-hole digger, a bag of concrete mix, and no explanation. "You're Victor Frey's nephew," he said. "That's right. You have his way of standing in the middle of a job without starting it." Donovan looked at the sagging porch. "I was assessing." Isaac unloaded the concrete mix. "Southwest corner post is rotted through. I can see it from the road." "I saw it." "Then we agree." Isaac returned the next morning with roofing screws and plumbing tape and the news that he had made too much coffee and someone should drink it. He worked without issuing direction and accepted help without acknowledging it was help. Their conversations were brief and bone-dry and somehow warmer than longer ones. He won Beau's confidence on the second day by producing a dog biscuit from his jacket pocket. Beau regarded this as the finest development in recent memory, and followed Isaac from post to post for the rest of the afternoon, with the expression of a dog who has identified a relationship worth cultivating. Slate took longer. She remained within sight of Donovan during the loud work and watched Isaac from a careful middle distance. On the 4th day, while Donovan was clearing old wire from the fence line, Slate's right paw caught in a rusted loop of barbed wire buried under dead grass. She made one sharp sound. When Donovan crouched toward her, her body went tense. He placed his open hand on the ground between them. He did not reach for the paw, he waited. Slate looked from his face to his fingers. Twice she pulled slightly toward the fence. Twice she stopped herself and looked at him again, working through it in the methodical way she worked through everything. At last, she put the trapped paw near his hand. He removed the wire slowly, checked the pad, cleaned the puncture, and wrapped it with gauze from his belt kit. When he finished, Slate stayed where she was. Then she placed the bandaged paw lightly on the toe of his work boot, the way someone might set something down carefully so it doesn't make noise. The weight was almost nothing. Donovan left his hand at his side and looked at the foothills going blue in the late afternoon, and understood that he had not been offered obedience. He had been offered something harder to earn. The goats arrived on a Wednesday in the back of Isaac's trailer. He had driven to a farm near Collie and returned with 2 Boer cross duelings he described as a practical livestock decision, and which he had clearly named before remembering he was not keeping them. Clemmy was 8 months old, cream-colored and wide through the shoulders, with amber eyes that catalogued everything around her for its edibility. She bleated with the authority of an animal who had never considered that her opinions might not be relevant. Fern was 6 months, smaller and darker, with a pale muzzle and careful ears that swiveled toward sounds before the rest of her body followed. Where Clemmy moved toward things, Fern watched first. Donovan recognized the contrast immediately and said nothing about it. He put both dogs on long leads before Isaac opened the trailer gate. Clemmy stepped out and announced her arrival. Beau launched himself backward, caught his own feet, and sat down heavily 6 meters away with the expression of a dog reconsidering several major decisions. Slate retreated behind Donovan's left leg and peered around him at the 2 animals that were each roughly a third of her size. Isaac leaned against the trailer and did not conceal his satisfaction. "These are the herding dogs," he said. "They're evaluating." Clemmy advanced on Beau and bleated again. Beau examined the direction of British Columbia, as though something had caught his attention there. Isaac laughed until he had to put one hand against the gatepost. Donovan tried not to join him. The sight of a working dog pretending an 8-month-old goat did not exist finally broke through his control. Slate glanced up at the sound, surprised. Beau returned with dignity and sat at Donovan's heel as though he had never left. Donovan did not rush the introduction. Over the following days, he worked Slate and Beau around the enclosure on long leads, rewarding stillness, shortening distance slowly. Beau improved in bursts, arriving at a good position and immediately overshooting it by 1 step. Slate improved the way she did everything, by studying the goat's ears and the rhythm of their hooves, before deciding whether to move at all. On the 6th morning, Fern approached the fence and extended her muzzle toward Slate through the wire. Slate's shoulders tightened. Donovan said nothing and did not shorten the lead. 7 seconds passed. Slate leaned forward and touched her nose to Fern's. Fern returned to her hay. Slate remained in place, her tail moving once slowly. Isaac, watching from the gate, said, "She's going to be better at this than he is. He has potential. He has enthusiasm. That's not the same thing." Beau, at that moment, discovered the fence gate had a latch he could nose open, and spent the remainder of the afternoon demonstrating this to no one in particular. It was Isaac who first noticed the posts along the north fence line listing toward the trees. 3 posts leaned inward, the wire sagging between them in a long arc, and a narrow crack had appeared in the soil at the base of the center post. The ground there held the cold longer than the rest of the field, and in the April melt it had not dried at the same rate. "Don't go past that line," Isaac said after Donovan photographed it. "I had no plans to. Most people don't before they do." Isaac studied the crack without touching it. "Your uncle mentioned that north section once, said there was old homestead infrastructure under the terrace from before the war. He stopped fencing it in the 90s and never said why." Donovan moved both dogs and the goats to the southern pasture that evening. He phoned the county land use office the following morning and left a message for the hazard engineer, a woman named Daphne Kowalski, whose name appeared on the regional contact sheet he found in his uncle's desk. He found other things in that desk. A photograph of his uncle and his father standing in front of this farmhouse in what appeared to be 1978, both squinting into prairie sun. A receipt from a Claresholm supplier dated 2004, and at the back of the bottom drawer, a small leather notebook with his uncle's name pressed into the cover. He placed it on the kitchen table. He was not ready for it yet. The night the ground opened was a Tuesday in late April. Daphne's crew was scheduled Thursday. The forecast had called for rain, which arrived Monday, continued Tuesday, and did not stop. By midnight, the drainage ditch behind the barn was running full and carrying sound with it, a low, constant rush that made the house feel smaller. Donovan woke at 2 in the morning for no particular reason he could name. Slate was standing at the south-facing window with her nose against the glass, perfectly still. He had learned the difference between her "this is interesting" posture and her "something is wrong" posture. This was the second kind. He got up and went out. Clemmy was not in the southern pen. The latch was intact, but there was a gap at the base of the gate that had not been there yesterday. The post had shifted in the saturated soil, and the bottom rail no longer sat flush with the ground. A small, determined body had gone under. Hoofprints led into the mud heading north along the drainage ditch. Donovan went back inside for his rain gear, his headlamp, and a length of rope. He sent a message to Isaac's phone, "Clemmy loose, following north drainage. If I don't check in within 10 minutes, come," and waited until the delivered notice appeared. He followed the hoofprints along the high side of the ditch, testing each step before shifting his weight. Slate walked at his left, pausing each time the soil changed beneath her paws and looking back at him before continuing. Beau worked the scent ahead on a long lead, intense and focused in a way that made him almost unrecognizable from the dog who stole rubber boots. The trail curved north into the poplar stand along the terrace. Donovan heard Clemmy before he saw her, a thin, frightened sound from somewhere below the level of the trail. He moved around a thicket and stopped. The ground ahead had opened. A section of the terrace roughly 3 meters across had collapsed along an old subsurface drain line. The edges were ragged and black, and the spring melt running in the ditch had found the opening and was pouring through it. On a narrow shelf of earth on the far side of the collapse, Clemmy stood with her legs spread wide for balance, water moving around her hooves. She cried when the headlamp found her. Donovan tied both dogs to a birch tree uphill of the opening. He wrapped his rope around the trunk, passed the working end through the D-ring on his belt, and approached the edge from above, dropping to one knee to spread his weight across the slope. He could almost reach her, another half-meter. He leaned. The edge went. The drop was 3 meters and fast, the slope taking him sideways rather than straight down, and then the chamber wall arrived and stopped him. His left forearm came across a timber. The rope at his belt caught against the birch and slowed the final meter of the fall, so that the impact was painful rather than catastrophic, but the timber had him, and it did not move when he pressed against it. Cold water was already flowing around his boots. Clemmy was on a shelf 4 meters across from him, wet and shaking but upright. Above, through the torn earth and rain, Beau's face appeared at the edge. His folded ear was flat. He did not bark. Donovan tried his radio. Static stone and 2 meters of Alberta soil swallowed signal the same way they swallowed daylight. He looked up at Beau. He thought about the southern fence and the afternoons of patient repetition, and the morning Beau had finally lowered his nose to Isaac's boot prints in the mud and followed them all the way through wet grass to where the older man was repairing a gate by the creek. He thought about Isaac saying one day that ridiculous game will matter, and himself answering most useful things start as games. Slate had fallen with the slope, and her lead had caught on a root, slowing her enough. She scrambled down the bank and pressed against his right side, her nose to his wrist, her dark eyes reading his face. Donovan raised his free arm toward Beau. "Find Isaac," he said. Beau didn't move. His gaze went from Donovan to Slate, and the weight of leaving both of them was visible in every line of him. "Go." 1 step back. Then Beau turned and his shape crossed through the April rain and disappeared between the spruce trees, and the sound of his paws on wet ground grew smaller, and then was gone, swallowed by the dark and the distance and the rain. Donovan formed a loop with his spare lead and threw it across the chamber toward Clemmy. The first attempt fell short. The second went over her head. The third settled around her chest. He tightened it slowly, not enough to frighten her, just enough to anchor her to the shelf. "Angry is better than gone," he told her. Slate pressed harder against his side. Each time his breathing went shallow with the cold, her muzzle found his wrist and nudged it back to wakefulness. She had not been trained to do this. She simply refused to let the silence grow too deep, the way some living things understand instinctively that presence itself is a form of rescue. The water climbed past his ankle, then his knee. He did not know if Beau had made it. He did not know if Beau had stayed on the trail or turned back toward the sound of Slate's breathing, which would have been the simpler thing to do, the thing that every instinct in him would have demanded. He had no way of knowing. For the first time in years, his survival depended entirely on trust, not in training or preparation or the tools on his belt, but in a 9-month-old dog with a folded ear and an unholy interest in rubber boots. He had not planned on this being the shape it took. Beau hit the creek crossing at full speed and went into his belly. He came out the other side and kept running. A downed poplar blocked the trail below the first bend. Beau went under it, got wedged, reversed, and went over it. He landed badly in mud deep enough to cover his paws, shook once, and kept running. Isaac had been standing at his kitchen window for 11 minutes, phone in hand, watching the lane, when he heard the scratching at the door. He opened it. Beau stumbled inside, soaked through and shaking, the broken end of his lead dragging across the floor. He seized the leg of Isaac's work trousers and pulled toward the porch, released it, and barked twice, a sound that had nothing casual in it. Isaac looked at the broken lead clip. He had seen that particular break before, years ago, in a flooding pen. He put on his jacket and boots and reached for the phone. Daphne Kowalski had been on standby since receiving Donovan's message to the county office. She asked Isaac 3 specific questions, confirmed the access route, and told him her crew would be there in 20 minutes. "Don't approach the collapse alone," she said. Isaac looked at Beau, who was already at the door. "I may not have complete jurisdiction over that," he said. The rescue vehicles came up the gravel road 16 minutes later, with floodlights that turned the April dark into an approximation of afternoon. Daphne's team anchored uphill of the terrace, swept the collapse with lights, and found Donovan's headlamp flashing from the chamber below. The lead technician, a compact man named Marco, who moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had made difficult descents his profession, went down on the main line with a medical bag and a secondary rope. He arrived in the chamber and assessed the situation with 2 sweeps of his headlamp. "Marco," he said, "we're getting all of you out. What's pin?" "Left forearm timber, water's at my knee." Marco examined the beam, the wall behind it, and the water rising along the base. He attached an inflatable lifting bag beneath the timber and rigged a padded sling for Clemmy. The goat struggled until Slate made one short, flat sound from across the chamber. Clemmy went still long enough for Marco to secure the straps. The team lifted Clemmy through the opening. Isaac caught her at the surface and wrapped her in a horse blanket. Marco returned to Slate. She would not step into the rescue harness. She pressed harder against Donovan's side, her eyes not leaving his face. "She won't leave you," Marco said. Donovan put his hand against Slate's muzzle. Part of him, the part that had been here for more than 40 minutes in cold water, with nothing but her warmth between him and something he couldn't name, wanted to let her stay. Her presence had become as structural as the stone wall. But the water was at his thigh now, and the wall behind the timber had begun to move. "Slate," he said in the voice that had never been a request, "go." Her ears came down. She licked his wrist once, slowly the way she did everything. Then she allowed Marco to guide her into the harness. She looked at Donovan until the darkness came between them. Marco placed the lifting bag beneath the beam, ran a secondary line around Donovan's chest, and counted to 3. The timber came up 4 centimeters. Pain moved from his forearm to his shoulder like a white light turning on behind his eyes. Marco moved fast. The timber shifted. Donovan's arm came free. From behind the collapsed wall, a deep liquid sound began. Water under pressure, finding the path the old drain had always been intended to carry. Daphne's voice came down sharp and clear. "We need to move now." Marco and Donovan cleared the opening together. The surface team dragged them across the marked ground, just as the chamber exhaled a wall of black water and broken timber, and the shelf where Clemmy had stood disappeared into roaring dark. On the far side of the safety barrier, Slate reached Donovan before anyone else. She pushed her face against his chest and stood there, her whole body shaking with something that had nothing to do with cold. Beau came more slowly behind her. His legs were uncertain under him, and there was mud on every part of him. He pressed his head against Donovan's free hand and closed his eyes. Isaac stood nearby with his arms folded, pretending to assess the county crew's equipment setup. "You messaged me before you went in," he said eventually. "You told me to. And you actually did it." Isaac looked at the collapsed terrace. "That may be the most unnatural thing you've done since you got here." Donovan spent 2 nights in hospital in Pincher Creek. His forearm was severely bruised but not fractured. His shoulder would take weeks. The doctors recommended rest with the specific confidence of people who had not yet met him. Isaac drove him back on a morning with a cold blue sky and no clouds, the kind of Alberta spring day that offered no apology for the one before it. County engineers had filled the collapsed section, redirected the surface drainage, and installed permanent fencing well back from the terrace edge. The farmhouse, the equipment shed, and the southern pasture had been declared sound. The north section would remain closed. Donovan watched the orange barrier stakes pass outside the truck window and felt something he did not immediately recognize, which turned out to be relief at being accurate about a thing that could have hurt worse. Isaac stopped the truck near the barn and did not get out. Slate appeared from behind the equipment shed at a pace that was, for her, quick. She stopped in front of Donovan and looked at his face for 2 full seconds, her usual careful assessment, before stepping forward and pressing her forehead against his chest. She did not jump. She simply placed herself against him and stood there, as though confirming that the shape she had been waiting for was real. Beau came from around the other side of the truck at full speed, braked to a skidding halt less than a meter from Donovan's walking stick, sat down with great deliberateness, and immediately undermined the performance by making a sound in his throat that was very close to a sob. Donovan put his hand on Beau's head. Beau pressed upward into it and held the folded ear tight against his skull. Neither dog barked, neither asked for anything. They leaned. Donovan had spent most of his adult life returning to empty rooms. He had told himself this was a form of freedom, and had believed it for long enough that the belief had calcified into something that no longer needed to be examined. He had come to this property with the intentions of a man who has learned that intentions are the safest kind of distance. He had been wrong about what he was arriving to. That evening, after Isaac had gone and the goats were settled and the dogs were fed, Donovan sat at the kitchen table and opened his uncle's leather notebook. His uncle had written in careful block letters, the same hand as the equipment tags and the fence post markers. Most of the entries were practical. Field notes, supplier names, the date each fence section was replaced. Near the back, the tone changed. I have been thinking about why I stayed on this property after there was no longer a practical reason to stay. The sensible thing would have been to sell after Clara died and move somewhere smaller. Several people told me this. They were right about the sensible part. But a man can be sensible his whole life and end up very far from anywhere. The land didn't keep me. I want to be clear about that. Land doesn't keep anyone. What kept me was that I had made a place here where things expected to see me return. The dog at the door, the neighbor across the fence, the animals in the pen, they didn't hold me in place. They just made leaving feel like what it actually was, instead of what I had been calling it. I don't know who will read this. I don't know if I'll have anyone to leave it to who needs it. But if I do, the property is not the inheritance. The inheritance is the argument the property makes, which is that staying is not weakness, and belonging somewhere is not the same as being trapped there. Come back when you've stopped calling the leaving freedom. Donovan read the last line twice. He sat for a long time in the kitchen of the house that smelled of pine smoke and damp wool and 2 dogs sleeping near the stove. Outside, the southern pasture was quiet. The Rockies caught the last of the light in the west and held it a few minutes longer than the valley below, the way mountains always do, as though reluctant to let a day finish. Beau, from his position near the stove, opened one eye, confirmed Donovan was still in the room, and went back to sleep. Slate raised her head and looked at him. The same careful, unhurried assessment she had offered through the crate wire in Claresholm, and then put her head back down and pressed her chin to the floor. Donovan closed the notebook and left his hand resting on the cover. He had driven from High River believing the property was something to manage, a practical task, a responsible completion of unfinished business. He had arrived with the intentions of a man who had learned, through long and painful practice, that intentions were the safest form of distance. Slate had stayed beside him in the dark because she understood something that 40 minutes in cold water had made impossible to argue with. Some things cannot be solved alone, and the determination to try is not strength. It is a habit, worn past the point of usefulness, that looks like independence from the outside and feels like something else entirely from within. Beau had run into the April dark not because he was unafraid. He had been afraid, visibly, completely, in the honest way only animals and children allow themselves to be afraid. But because he ran anyway. He had carried the need of the two beings he loved most, through rain and mud and fallen timber, and a flooded creek crossing to the one door where someone was waiting to open it. Donovan had thought he was the one doing the rescuing the day he drove south from Claresholm with 2 crates in his truck bed. He understood now, in the way understanding arrives when it has finally exhausted every alternative, that the rescuing had been mutual all along. In the weeks that followed, the farmhouse changed. A second chair appeared at the kitchen table. Photographs went up on the wall, Colleen at the lake in 2016 with her face turned away from the camera, the way it always was. His uncle and his father in 1978, squinting into prairie sun. One Donovan took himself. Slate and Beau in the southern pasture. Both of them watching something in the grass with the complete attention that only dogs and children bring to the world. Isaac came most mornings with strong coffee, and the news that he had made too much by accident. They rebuilt the goat pen with proper hardware. Beau tested the new latch for 4 days before accepting it. Marlene called in May and asked first about the dogs, and only afterward about Donovan, which he found he did not mind at all. The cabin no longer smelled of abandonment. It smelled of pine smoke, hay, muddy paws, and ordinary life, the kind that does not announce itself as meaningful until you realize, quietly and without ceremony, that you have been living inside it for some time. Some grace does not arrive loudly. It does not come as certainty or revelation, or anything that resembles the dramatic turning points we imagine for ourselves in the dark. Sometimes it comes as a paw pushed beneath a crate door, as a dog pressing her forehead against a man's chest without asking him to be ready, as a young, foolish, folded-eared animal running through April rain toward a light he had been there before and trusted was still on. If something has ever found you when you were not looking, a dog, a neighbor, a letter left in a desk drawer by someone who knew you would need it, tell us about it in the comments below. We would like to hear. Subscribe to Paws of Grit for more stories of courage, loyalty, and the grace that meets us where we've stopped expecting it. May something be waiting at the door when you come home tonight.